That area's restricted, my father said, stepping directly in front of me. You don't have clearance for that. He said it the way he said most things. Quietly, confidently, like the matter had already been settled before anyone else had a chance to think about it. We were standing in the arrivals hall at Pearson International, and there were people around us, travelers with rolling suitcases, families waiting with handwritten signs. My mother stood just behind him, her hands folded over her purse, watching. My name is Nina Okafor. I was 33 years old that afternoon, and I had spent the better part of a decade building a career that most people in my field considered exceptional. I was a superintendent with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, Federal Division. I had commanded operations across 3 provinces, worked alongside Crown prosecutors on organized crime files, and 6 months before that day at the airport, I had led the security coordination for a ministerial visit that had made national news. None of this was secret. None of it was complicated to explain. But my father, Victor Okafor, had never really asked. He introduced me at dinners with his business partners as my daughter who works for the federal government. Full stop. That was the sentence. Never the rank. Never the file type. Never the part where I'd spent 4 years working overnight shifts in Edmonton before anyone trusted me with a case that mattered. Just government. I used to think it was a language thing. English was his third, and he was always careful with vocabulary around people he wanted to impress. But I watched him describe his accountant's credentials in precise detail at a backyard barbecue once, and I understood then that it wasn't the language. It was the choice. My mother, Lorraine, always knew more than she let on. She had been the one who drove me to my very first posting interview, who waited in the parking lot for 2 hours because I'd asked her not to come inside. She kept every newspaper clipping that mentioned my name in a manila folder in the kitchen drawer, even after I told her she didn't have to. When I was promoted to inspector, she cried on the phone for 10 minutes, and then made me promise to call my father and tell him myself. I did. He said, "Good. Are you eating properly up there?" That was my father, Victor Okafor, a man who had come to Toronto from Lagos in the early 90s with $400 and a contact number scrawled on a paper napkin, who had built 3 restaurants from nothing, who drove a Lexus and sat on the board of his local business improvement association. He had earned everything he had through genuine, grinding work, and I respected that about him deeply. What I could never reconcile was how a man who had spent 30 years clawing through closed doors somehow forgot, every time, that I was doing the same thing. That afternoon at Pearson, I had flown in from Ottawa on a file I couldn't discuss in detail. There was a federal delegation arriving, and I was part of the coordination team. I was in dress uniform, the dark navy tunic, the lanyard, the service badges I had accumulated over 11 years. I had my travel bag over one shoulder, and I was moving toward the secure corridor where RCMP colleagues and government liaisons were assembled for the arrival. I hadn't known my parents would be there. My mother had texted me that morning to say she and my father were at Pearson picking up my aunt, who was flying in from Halifax. I'd replied with a heart emoji and figured our paths wouldn't cross. Pearson swallows people. But my father had sharp eyes. He saw me from across the hall. I was maybe 30 meters from the corridor entrance, and he moved, not toward me in greeting, toward me in interception. He crossed the floor quickly, the way he did when he thought something was about to go wrong, and by the time I noticed him, he was already in front of me. "That area's restricted," he said. "You don't have clearance for that." I stopped. For a moment, I just stood there. He was looking past me toward the corridor entrance, where 2 of my colleagues in uniform were visible, and 2 civilian staffers in lanyards were checking a list on a tablet. My father had the expression he wore when he was certain, brow slightly lowered, jaw set, a kind of preemptive disappointment already forming at the corners of his mouth. "Dad," I said. "Nina." He said my name like a closing argument. "I can see what that area is. Those are government officials. Whatever you're thinking, this is not the time to." "Victor." My mother's voice came from behind him, gentle, a single word of caution. He didn't turn around. I looked at him for a moment. I thought about explaining. I thought about the 7 words it would take to clarify everything. But something stopped me. Not anger, not pride, something quieter than that. A kind of tired recognition that whatever I said in that moment he would find a way to fit it into the story he'd already decided was true. I had learned over years that some explanations don't land, not because the listener can't understand, but because they've already decided what they're looking at. My father had decided what he was looking at. He saw his daughter, the one he raised, the one who used to call him from dorm rooms, asking what to do when things got hard, standing at an entrance she wasn't supposed to cross. He didn't see the rank on my shoulder. He didn't see the badge on my chest. He didn't see 11 years. The strangest part wasn't that he was doing it. The strangest part was how completely ordinary it felt. How many times had he stepped in front of me like this, not at airports but at kitchen tables and family dinners, in the way he'd pivot away from my work and towards someone else's, in the way he'd nod when I mentioned a case and then immediately ask my cousin about his accounting practice in Brampton. The airport was just the first time he'd done it physically, with an actual step. I was about to say something, I still don't know exactly what, when I heard my name. Not Nina, my title. Superintendent Okafor. The voice came from the corridor entrance. My colleague Sergeant Villeneuve had spotted me and was calling across the distance between us, holding the door open with one hand. We're starting the briefing in 4 minutes, ma'am. The minister's team is already in position. The hall around us went quiet in that particular way a crowd goes quiet when something has shifted, and nobody is sure yet what just happened. My father turned. He turned slowly, like he was hoping that when he completed the movement the scene in front of him would be different from what he'd just heard. Sergeant Villeneuve was looking at me. Not at my father. Not at my mother. At me, with the kind of professional expectation that only exists between people who have a task to complete and a clock running against them. I watched my father's face change. I wish I could say it felt good. People often assume those moments must feel satisfying. The vindication, the visible crack in someone's certainty. But what I felt was far more complicated than satisfaction. I felt something that took me a long time to name. It was grief maybe, not for myself. For the distance. For all the years inside that distance, and the question of whether they could ever be crossed. I nodded at Sergeant Villeneuve. One moment. Then I looked at my father. He was standing very still now. The confidence that had carried him across the arrivals hall was gone. My mother had her hand on his arm. I don't think she even realized she'd reached for it. She was looking at me with the expression she used when she wanted to say something but knew it wasn't the time. I had seen that expression at graduations, at promotions, and once briefly at a commendation ceremony she hadn't been invited to, but had driven 4 hours to attend anyway, standing at the back of the room. I'll call you both tonight, I said. We can have dinner before my aunt's flight back. And then, I walked through the door. I didn't look back. Not because I was being cold, but because I had a security brief to finalize and 4 minutes had become 3, and whatever my father needed to process was going to take longer than I had available in that moment. That's the part nobody talks about. The protagonist in these stories always gets to stand still and watch the other person absorb the revelation. In real life, you usually have somewhere to be. The dinner happened 2 nights later, after my aunt had already returned to Halifax. It was just the 3 of us at my parents' house in Mississauga, the house I grew up in, with the good tablecloth my mother only brought out when something felt important. My father was quiet through most of the meal in a way that was different from his usual quiet. Victor was never truly silent. He was always in the middle of an assessment, an opinion forming, waiting for the right moment to offer it. But this quiet was something else. It was the quiet of a man who had been doing arithmetic and kept arriving at a number that didn't make sense to him. My mother had made jollof rice and fried plantain, which she knew I missed when I was in Ottawa. She talked enough for the 3 of us, the way she did when she sensed something needed time before it could be said directly, and I let her, because I wasn't ready for the conversation I could feel coming. It came after dinner. My father asked if I wanted tea, and I said yes, and he made it himself rather than leaving it to my mother, which was unusual enough that I paid attention. He set the mug in front of me and then sat down across the table and looked at his hands. I didn't know, he said. I waited. At the airport. I didn't know what, I didn't realize. He stopped. Started again. I saw you walking toward that corridor, and I thought you were confused. I thought I was stepping in to help. I wrapped both hands around the mug. The tea was good. He'd remembered how I took it. I know, I said. I know you thought that. But I've been sitting with it since. He looked up, and I don't think it was only about the airport. That surprised me. My father was not typically a man who circled back to his own behavior and interrogated it. He was more comfortable moving forward, So when he sat there at the same kitchen table where I had done homework as a child and said plainly that it wasn't only about the airport, I felt something shift. "What do you mean?" I asked. "I tell people you work for the federal government." He said it plainly, without defense. "I always kept it simple. I told myself I was being modest on your behalf, or that I didn't understand enough to explain it properly." I looked at him. He wasn't wrong about the second part. He genuinely hadn't asked enough questions to understand what I did, but understanding and asking were both choices, and he had chosen simplicity every single time. "Dad," I said, "do you know what it costs to keep doing something at the level I've been doing it, when the person whose opinion matters most to you treats it like a footnote?" He didn't answer right away. "I'm not asking you to announce my rank at dinner parties. I never wanted that. I just wanted you to be curious, to want to know. Not the title, just what my days are actually like, what I'm proud of, what's difficult, what I'm still trying to figure out." He was quiet for a long time. My mother, from the other room, didn't come in. She understood that some conversations need to breathe without a witness. "I think," my father said finally, "that I was afraid of not understanding, so I stopped asking." It wasn't a complete answer. It didn't account for 11 years, or the deflections at family events, or the way he'd light up describing a stranger's success while keeping mine in a single sentence. One honest admission doesn't settle a decade of accumulated distance. But it was the first time he'd said something true about himself, in a conversation that was actually about me. I drank my tea and let the quiet sit between us. Outside, a neighbor's car pulled into a driveway. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen. Mississauga on a Wednesday night, sounding exactly the way it always had. "I would like to understand what you do," he said, "if you're open to that." I looked at him across the table. This man who had built something from nothing and never once asked for credit from anyone outside this house. This man who had driven me to my first karate class and my first job interview, and stood at the back of every school gymnasium when I received an award, arms crossed, not clapping the way the other parents clapped, but there. Always there. Presence and sight are not the same thing. I had spent a long time wishing he could tell the difference. "I'm open to it," I said. "I don't tell this story to humiliate my father. Victor Okafor is a man who built a real life from a paper napkin and a borrowed phone number, and that matters, more than a little. But loving someone and truly seeing them are not always the same act, and for most of my adult life, my father was far better at one than the other. The airport didn't fix everything between us. Relationships like ours don't get fixed in a single afternoon at an arrival's gate. But that moment gave him something that years of my explanations never quite had. Something external and undeniable, a voice that wasn't mine calling my rank, a door opening that had always been mine to walk through. I didn't need him to witness it. But I won't pretend it didn't matter that he finally did. Sometimes the people who take longest to see you become the ones who understand you most honestly. Once they stop protecting the version of you they invented and start looking at the one standing right in front of them. Tell me in the comments. Was there ever someone in your life who couldn't see what you had built until the world made it impossible to look away? Share this with someone who needs it today, and subscribe for more stories from Family Shadows.